great day to brew, baby. What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Millzy, back with Hometown Commander. And per usual arrangement, we are back for another episode of Millzy Brews, the show where I give you my first take deck tech for the commander in question. And today is our first commander for Phyrexia All We Want, and I'm really excited because I think this set brings a lot of fun things. When I originally saw this deck, today we're doing the Corrupting Influence Precon, and today we're going to be building around Ixhel's Scion of Atraxa. This is the face commander of the deck. Next week, we're going to be doing Vishkraz, the secondary commander for the deck, and I'm going to be doing that for the other Precon as well. This week we'll be doing, I think it's Niali, and then the next week we'll do the Phoenix-looking commander. I'll try my best to hold my opinions on which I prefer until the end of the video, so you can kind of take the deck in for yourself and see what you think. But when I originally saw this precon being abs and being Corrupting Influence is the name of the deck, which makes you think it has something to do with either poison or infect, I was very intrigued to see what this deck was going to give us. And we got Ixhel, Scion of Atraxa. 1 white, black, green for a 2/5 flying, vigilance, and toxic 2, which is a pretty cool set of abilities in itself. And then corrupted at the beginning of your end step. Each opponent who has 3 or more poison counters exiles the top card of their library face down. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. You may spend mana as they were mana of any colors to cast those spells. I don't know how much I love Wizards putting commanders that play around with other people's stuff, like the top cards of their libraries and their spells and stuff, as face commanders or precons. But I think Ixhel is going to do this in a very interesting way. It's not rush down and kill our opponents with poison counters. We kind of want to give each opponent 3 poison counters and then reap the value. But I think the problem with a deck like this is we still need to end the game. And I think that's going to be difficult for Ixhel because, you know, are we going to get lost in the weeds of really enjoying this value, or are we actually going to end the game? So I have my Ixhel deck for you that I prepared. If you guys like this type of content, give me a like, subscribe if you like it. Let me know in the comments what you would add to Ixhel. What cards did you love from the precon? What do you think you should add to Ixhel that I missed? I'd be very intrigued to find out. But like I do for all my brews, I like to start with the lands. The land base of the precon wasn't too bad, but I think just adding a few more cards really help. We're playing a ton of basics because we want to play all of that ramp that green affords us with, but we're also playing the Cavern Souls Path of Ancestry out because a lot of our creatures are Phyrexians, so we can take advantage of that shared creature type between Ixhel and then all the Phyrexians in our deck for Cavern Souls and Path of Ancestry. And then the cool part is Cavern Souls can protect our commander coming down to help us out with that. Getting up to the enchantments, I wanted to try a couple new things, but I think at the end of the day, we have to guarantee that we get the damage we get. I mean, we're going to need a couple creatures to get through to get our 3 poison counters, right? On each commander, but I think at each player, but I think at the end of the day, we still need to end the game. So I try to pick a good mix of enchantments here that are going to do one of two things: either get us going on value or help us in the game. Beastmaster Ascension is going to help us pump all of our creatures eventually. The deck seems to be half okay at making these 1/1 might tokens with Toxic 1. Next week, when we look at Vishkraz, I'm going to go into the token side of this deck. Today, Ixhel is going to be more of just overrunning with value, and so I think Beastmaster Ascension does that. Yes, if you pump the creature up to a 7/7 and it has Toxic 1, it still only gives 1 poison counter, but I think it just makes it harder and harder to block. Black Mark Connection gets us that value, giving us the option of either a treasure token, drawing a cord, or making a changeling, which can be a Phyrexian, or we can do all 3 of them. I like Black Market Connections. I genuinely think it's an interesting card, especially in black decks. I don't know if it's a necessary card in this deck, but I still think it's probably worth the value. Cover Darkness is like the card in this deck that's probably going to help us win a game. Cover Darkness comes down and we choose a creature type. I think in most cases we're going to choose Phyrexian since most of our creatures are. And then you give creatures that chosen type fear. They can't be blocked except by artifact creatures or black creatures. Most of the time, this should allow us to hit through on most people for not being able to be blocked. Of course, there's going to be players that are going to have artifact or black creatures that we're going to have to do a little bit harder, but I think this is going to help us, especially in the early game, get through to get those first few poison counters on so that Ixhel can start getting us that value. Doubling Season, we want Doubling Season over Parallel Lives here, because we want to, because Doubling Season will double the amount of counters we put on players, so we will get double the poison counters in that. Glistening Oil, giving something Infect. Infect is just as good in this deck as Toxic is. No, we won't get some of these effects that say, like, when a creature with Toxic does X, but I think Infect is just as good, because what it's going to do is just get us through for those poison encounters with big damage. The cool thing that I want to try to do in this deck that could be fun is giving creature Toxic and Infect at the same time, because both of those are going to proc separately, and you're going to get poison counters for each of them. Mirari's Wake, going to double up our mana, give us a little buff. Necroching Communion seems fun. We can put this on our commander, and my understanding is if we have two separate, so let's say we put this on Ixhel, right? Now Ixhel has Toxic 2 twice. What should happen is if Ixhel does combat damage to a player, we should actually get two separate versions of Toxic to trigger, which could be kind of fun, depending on what you put this on. But it just brings Ixhel back under our control if it dies. It just seems like a good protection. We've seen cards like this with Kaya's Ghost Form and things like that. I like this one just because it adds Toxic 2 as well. Norn's Decree seems like one of those cards that's perfect in the early game. Put it down, and if our opponents attack us, they get a poison counter, but if they attack other people, the attacking player draws a card, could kind of convince people to attack other ways to try to protect us. I think there's good and bad sides to Norn's Decree. I don't love the card, but I can see where it's going to do well into some more casual tables. Paladin class, one of my favorite enchantments for creature-based decks, helping stop your opponent's cast cards a little bit. The level 2 just pumps your team, and then level 3 turns your attacking creatures into powerhouses, depending on how many creatures you attack with. Phyrexia, another Infect classic, comes down, gives one of our creatures Infect. We're going to put this on our big boys, and we got a couple big boys we're playing. Quest for Renewal is a card I want to try out in this deck, because I think we're going to be attacking enough with these little mites, these little 1/1s or other things in the deck. I think we're going to be able to turn on Quest for Renewal pretty easily, and that's going to allow all of our creatures to untap, and each of our opponents' untap steps. I think this is going to turn out well, and I'm kind of intrigued to see what this does. We could also just run straight up Vigilance, but I'm kind of intrigued to see what a card like this could do. Skrul's Hive is going to make us a mite every turn, but the other big thing I really like about this card is the bottom half, and this is going to help our entire deck. As long as an opponent, just one, has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. This is going to turn most of these 1/1s, these mid-range creatures that have Toxic, they're going to turn them all into lifelinkers, which I think is going to help us a lot, especially when we go up and talk about the big creatures that have Toxic. And then Smothering Tithe just to get us that value. Going into the artifacts, we're not needing too many mana artifacts because we're playing all of the ramps. We have the Arcane Signet, we have the Soul Ring. We're playing Glimmering Sphere that came in the deck. Whenever it comes in, we proliferate, so we're going to try to hopefully get some poison counters on people so that we can do it. We add 1 mana of any color, and then as soon as someone has 3 or more poison counters, we can tap it for 3 mana of any color. It just seems like a really good mana rock in this deck. In a deck where we're trying to get poison counters on our opponents, this seems like a really good mana rock for that. Felwar Stone, I would be very surprised if you sat down at a table and playing Commander where someone wasn't in these 3 colors, so I think Felwar Stone is going to do well for us. Chromatic Lantern just to help shore up that mana just a little bit, make sure we have all the colors we need. Catagian Grasp, when it comes in, we just put a -1/-1 on a creature. It doesn't even have to be our creature. We could just put on one of our opponents, and then 4 and tap it to proliferate. Once we get our poison counters up on our opponents, 4 mana a turn to get 1 more is probably not that bad of an idea when we have so much mana probably anyway. And then Grafted Exoskeleton to give a creature Infect. And again, we have a couple big creatures to give this to, but also if our opponent has no flying blockers, we can just give this to Ixhel. And then Ixhel has Infect and Toxic, and we're going to wrap up the amount of poison counters and damage we can do to our opponents. Getting into the instance, we're upping up the removal suite. Anguish Unmaking, Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within. We really want good removal. We're keeping that Mortify from the precon. We got the reprint of Noxious Revival, which is one of my favorite green cards for getting stuff back, and we don't mind paying 2 life for that. We're also playing Path and Swords. We want lots of removal, get things out of the way. Flawless Maneuver got reprinted in the other precon, but we will happily play it here to protect all of our creatures. Tainted Strike for that quick combat trick on a creature that isn't being blocked to give it Infect. And then Clever Concealment seems like a really cool card. It says we can Convoke, so our creatures could tap to help cast it. and number of target non-land permanents you control phase out. I'm going to go ahead and call it now. This card is going to become a staple in white creature decks because when you have the ability to tap your creatures instead of paying for this, and you basically get to just phase out every non-land permanent you control, it's going to get you a round of most board wipes. Farewell. All of your board wipes that just straight destroy anything that doesn't target. Technically, this could help you out with Cyclonic Rift and just phasing all your permanents out so they can't be bounced back to your hand. I think Clever Concealment is going to see a ton of play. If you're worried about getting one of these, get it now. I'm telling you, it's going to go up. This is going to be the flawless maneuver, Fierce Guardianship, not Fierce Guardianship, but this is going to be a flawless maneuver type card where it's going to hike up in value. And I really think this is going to start getting played in those white creature decks. Getting up into the sorceries, you're going to notice a lot of ramp, Cultivate, Farseek, Kadama's Reach, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, 3 visits. We want to get all of our lands, get them quickly. We're playing Nature's Lore and 3 visits because we can get the triomes, we can get the dual lands with them, and then we're playing a bunch of basics so that we have some to get. We're playing Triumph of the Hordes because we are already playing around with poison counters. We might as well finish the game with them. Phyrexia Outbreak seems kind of cool. Each opponent gets a poison counter, and then each opponent control gets -1/-1 for each poison counter they control. If we really want to get our opponents to 4 or 5 before we play this, because then that's guaranteed to probably knock out most of the creatures they have. But it's an interesting board wipe for that. Unnatural Restoration is basically a regrowth, getting a card back to our hand and then proliferating as well. That seems super good. White 7 Twilight seems too good not to play. It is a board wipe if we spend 7 mana, but if we don't, it just gives us a bunch of creatures with Toxic 1 that we can then use to attack and make good value with. And then Wormquake getting us a bunch of worms, and if our opponents have 3 more poison counters, which we really want them to get, right? The whole point of Ixhel is getting all of our creatures up to that 3 poison token kind of thresholds that we can start getting things off their deck. More often than not, Wormquake will get to that level for us and really just net us that value. All right, before we get into the creatures, we'll just talk really quickly about, I think Vraska is going to be a decent card in this deck. Planeswalkers and Commander are this mixed bag where you never quite know if they're going to be good or bad. If we can ever get to this thing to ultimate it, I think we're going to end up doing a lot of good. You may look at this and go, but Millzy, it doesn't have a plus, and it does. It 0 says you draw a card and lose a life and proliferate, and then you would actually put a counter onto Vraska when you proliferate. We do have some other cards in the deck that proliferate as well, so we're going to make sure we get Vraska up to 9, but when we get to 9, it says if a target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get poison counters equal to the difference. I really think we only need to do this on one player. I genuinely think once we hit to a certain point in the game, if we have our board set up, we're going to end up poisoning our opponents out. It's going to get very tough once they get up to 4 or 5 counters to really, in all honesty, not poison them out. With some of the creatures we've selected in Beastmaster Ascension and things like that, I think it's just going to get really easy to do. The one thing that I'm realizing under enchantments I didn't put in was something like Garruk's Uprising to give our creatures trample. Maybe we should have done that, but hey, that's an aside. Again, first run through of the deck, all I did was get the deck down to something that I would want to test, not necessarily a perfect list. That's the one thing I want to try to make clear, because I've seen some people give me some comments like, why aren't you running X card or Y card or running this random combo? Well, it's because this is my first shot at the deck list, just like a lot of people, and I think that's fun, being my first shot at a deck. But let's get into the creatures. Blight Mamba, I believe it came in the precon. In fact, you can regenerate it. Bloated Contaminator seems fun. Trample Toxic 1, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. So this is really cool because if this hits anyone, we can proliferate poison counters on everyone, and that is going to be really important. Contaminant Grafter seems kind of cool. The effect is kind of odd. The way this is worded is really interesting to me, and I'm kind of intrigued if this is just worded this way because they don't want to go ham. So it's worded whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to one or more players, proliferate. And so at first I was like, wait, well, no, a creature you control would never deal damage to more than one player. But I think it's worded that way because if it said whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, proliferate, it would be insanity. If you think about it, in a combat with that ability, you would have 3 creatures deal damage to 3 different players. You would proliferate 3 times, and you might even beat a table at that point with poison counters. So The more that I think about it, the more that I understand why it was worded like that. And then the corrupted abilities at the beginning of your end step, if opponent has 3 or more poison counters, draw a card, then you may put a land from your hand on the battlefield. We don't really want it for that. I think we really want it for the proliferate ability, but good card, 5/5 for 5 that has some upside, and we're going to take good advantage of it. It felt wrong not to play Elishnorn in the deck, just because I think we have a decent amount of ETBs in our deck, but I actually honestly feel like it also helps just shut off our opponents at this point and stop their ETBs from happening. We don't have a ton of ETB effects that are really good, but for stuff like Evolution Sage, where when a land enters the battlefield, we proliferate, we would love to do this twice. With Elishnorn, there's a couple effects in the deck where we want to do it twice. But I think more often than not, Elishnorn helps us and just hurts our opponents. But she's not needed in the deck. I think you could take her out for a lot of other things. But I don't know. It just felt right being a Phyrexian deck. Glissa's Retriever. Haste Toxic 3, which is great. Can't be blocked by a creature's power 2 or less. And whenever it dies, exile it. If you do, return X target cards from your graveyard to your hand, where X is the number of opponents who have 3 or more poison counters. So when it dies, we just get cards back. Seems pretty good. Grateful Apparition was in the precon. Whenever it deals damage to a player, proliferate, and it's in the air. So that should get it through more often than not. Icarats has Infect, but also when it comes down, each player gets a poison counter. Icarats is very well known in Infect decks to get your opponents going on the poison counter so that you would start proliferating them. Mondrak, Glory Dominus, kind of plays 2 roles. It's a token doubler, which is going to help us with cards like Fishgrass and things like that make tokens our Squelb's Hive, that kind of thing. And there's enough things in the deck that make tokens that I think it's worth it. Next week, when we talk about Vishgraz, Mondrak's going to be even better in that deck than it is in this deck. But I think it is going to do us enough good in this deck that it's worth having, especially when we're playing things like Smothering Tithe and Blackbark Connections. It will still give us some value. I just think next week, when we talk about Vishgraz, we'll talk about how much better value it has in that deck than in this deck. Necrogen Rot Priest seems like a really cool uncommon from the set. Toxic 2, whenever you creature you control toxic deals damage to a player, that player gets an additional poison counter. I feel like this is going to become one of those cards you want to get every game because it doesn't even need to attack. It just does its ability without ever needing to attack. So I really like the idea of this. I think this is going to end up making these little 1/1s even better if they can connect through, or make these big boys even more important to block. Norn's Choirmaster, Flying First Strike. Whenever your commander you control enters the battlefield or attacks, proliferate. This is great because as soon as we can get a poison counter on all of our opponents, now Ixhel itself can start attacking in the air and dealing chip damage away to people, and we're going to start proliferating when we do it, which I really like. This can also get doubled by Elishnorn on the ETB. Phyrexian Crusader, one of the more popular Phyrexian creatures. First strike protection from red and from white, and infect. So that infect again is just going to be a great for us. Phyrexian Swarmlord. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 insect creature token with infect on the battlefield for each poison counter your opponents have. So the longer the game goes with this card out, the more we're going to get. Plague Mirror can just tap for a mana. I'm not in love with Plague Mirror, but it got a reprint in the deck. Plague Stinger, 1/1 with infect up in the air, and that's great. Rhea Avor, Bane of Bladehold, is a card that I'm really intrigued to see how well this card works. I think this is going to end up being a good card in both this deck and especially in Vishgraz. And we'll talk about Vishgraz. We'll talk about this card in Vishgraz when we get to that next week. But it says, battle card, whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature you control gets +1/+1 until end turn. This is great when we're using all those little 1/1s. But it's at the beginning of combat on your turn. The next time target creature would deal combat damage to 1 or more players this combat, which is an interesting ability that, if you think about it that way, prevent that damage. If damage is prevented this way, create that many 1/1 colorless might creature tokens with toxic 1 and this creature can't block. I mean, Rhea Avor is really perfect with a creature like Tyrannix Rex, where you have 8 damage that you could potentially prevent, or and that kind of thing to get you 8 1/1s. I think it's going to be a really interesting card in this deck because it's going to pump all your little guys up, in a deck like Vishgraz when we start talking about that. But I also think that I think it's just going to end up pushing you forward because if you think about it, if you're let's say you have a free attack on a player in the air or something, and you have a little 2/2 that's going to attack them. If you care more about getting those 2/1/1s than you do that 2 damage that maybe, let's say it doesn't have infect or it doesn't have anything else, you do it and you just net the 1/1s and you push forward towards the next game. So I'm very intrigued at how this card works out, and like I said, we'll talk about it next week when we get into Vishkraz. Skittles himself, Skithrax the Blight Dragon, one of the most popular creatures with infect. Great target. Black can give it haste until end of turn. It's going to start infecting our opponents in the air, going to make it really hard to deal with. Skrelv Defector Might seems like a really interesting card. You can choose a creature and give it hexproof from a color until in turn it can't be blocked by creatures of that color. I think this is going to help us get creatures like Skittles and Tyrant Rex into certain players for good damage. So I kind of like this, even though it's 1 mana. It's a 1 mana 1/1. I think it'll end up doing us good. Slaughter Singer seems kind of interesting. Toxic 2, and then whenever another creature you control toxic attack, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I think this card might end up being better in Vishkraz than in this deck where you're trying to go wider, but I still think this does a good job. I still think that although not all of our creatures have toxic, I still could see a scenario where Slaughter Stinger still does a good job. I'm just not sure. A lot of this I'm going off based on what I think is going to be the case and not testing, and so I think this is one of those cards in specific where I'm going to learn a lot of lessons from actually playing the deck. Tyrant Rex, big old boy, can't be countered, trample ward 4, haste, toxic 4. This is a giant beater, and I hope that you can hit somebody with it and start spreading those toxic counters around, but hopefully ending the game against players with this card. Get this with a that Necrogen thing that gives them toxic 2. Get this with something that gives them those cards that give them additional counter when, Rot Priest out. This goes from toxic 4 to toxic 5, right? This is going to start ending games very quickly if we can get this out. And if we could protect it with other things, it just gets even better. Viridian Corruptor, whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact, but it has infect. I still think that's good. We want that removal. Vishkraz, I've referenced it multiple times, but we'll talk about it again next week when we do this deck. Menace, Toxic 1, whenever it enters the battlefield, create 3 1/1 Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1. And it gets +1/+1 for each poison counter your opponents have. Vishkraz seems like more. I guess I buried the lead earlier. This is the one that interests me more because I think going wide with the Might tokens can do a lot more than you think it will. There's a ton of enchantment support in Commander to make tokens even better than they actually are. And I have the want to make these Mights like 7/7 with Beastmaster Ascension out, or 8/8 or 9/9s, and just make them not only hard to block, but just completely menacing in their own right. I think Vishkraz seems like a really fun commander, and I can't wait to build it next week for you guys. So be looking out for that video next week. And then our last creature, Vorinclex, just another copy of Doubling Season, because its first ability says whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature, or a permanent or player, put twice that many on. But I also like Vorinclex because the bottom ability halves the amount of counters our opponents would do it. So if we're facing another poison deck or we're facing a +1/+1 counters deck, we're going to kind of shut them down. I love Vorinclex because it tends to be a lightning rod for removal that takes that lightning rod away from the things we really want on the board. And sometimes that's worth 6 mana if we can take advantage of that first ability once or twice, but then it eats the removal. At least it's eating the removal away from a card we want to keep down, whether it's Ixhel or Vishkraz or these other cards. We don't mind them getting taken out instead of them. Because our opponents might actually need to. Their deck might completely get shut down by Vorinclex being out. And so we are happy to let them remove this and keep our commander safe. What do you guys think of Ixhel? I generally am intrigued to see how a deck like this works. Like I said, I'm leaning towards Vishkraz, and I'm excited to kind of show you guys what my mind's come up with for Vishkraz next week when we talk about that. But what do you think of Ixhel? Are you guys interested in trying Ixhel out? I know that precons can be hit and miss with more entrenched players like me, but I've been looking for a Abzan kind of token aristocrats deck for a while. I have 1 or 2 that I've tried, and I'm intrigued to see maybe if this can be that deck. I think there are cards that can make these 1/1 Mights pretty effectively, and when you start doubling them with Anointed Procession and Mondrak, I think there's a good strategy there. So if that's something that interests you, next week we will have Vishkraz deck tech up on the channel. Wednesday is going to be Naomi, I think that's her name, the leader of the Boros deck. I'm actually very excited for that one. That one's a cool deck. I think I've got a good list that I think you guys will enjoy. And then next Wednesday will be the Phoenix looking commander. That's the secondary commander of that. And then after next week, we will get into the main deck or main set commanders. I'm sorry. And this Thursday, we're going to be doing the Thursday slot is going to turn into either personal brews, or I have made a giant list of old commanders that I still want to brew that I never got to brew on the channel. I want to brew for you guys. So this Thursday is going to be a green-black Aristocrats deck. So that's something that interests you. Check back on Thursday for that. That is everything I have for you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.